Now, having seen the difference between scheduled bank and non-scheduled bank, now let us look into the present basic structure of scheduled commercial banks. Now, the basic structure of scheduled commercial banks in India is again a matter of history. When India got independent, there were so many small banks and many banks failed. Even in the post-independence era, there were failure of some banks, but they were all very small and they were not having enough capital. And in the post-independent era, many banks used to advertise in paper saying that we are a scheduled bank. If you see those 1950 advertisements of banks in 1950s and 1955 in that range, many banks will say, I am a scheduled bank, I am a scheduled bank. Because people will believe in that bank, people will develop faith in that bank only when it is a scheduled bank. Now, the first major change in the consolidation phase that happened in the post-independent era in India was creation of State Bank of India. How State Bank of India was created? There was one imperial bank. The imperial bank was used by the Britishers to keep the king's money. It was a kind of state-owned and state-operated bank. The word imperial means king. Imperial palace means king's palace. Imperial garden means king's garden. Imperial bank means king's bank. Now, in the post-independent era, king became irrelevant. All are kings in India. In a democracy, all are kings. There were no separate king. Therefore, in 1957, the Imperial Bank of India, by an act of the government of India, by an act of the Parliament, was converted into State Bank of India. And then all the Imperial Bank of India branches were converted to State Bank. So, we have a public sector. That is the first instance of a public sector bank. Then in 1969, 14 banks were nationalized. They became the second instance of public sector banks. Let us see public sector banks in detail in the next 2 or 3 slides. Now, for the time being, it is suffice for you to understand a public sector bank is a bank whose majority of shares of which is held by the government of India. So, the public sector culture started in the post-independent era. First instance was State Bank of India, second was 14 nationalized banks, and then another batch of 6 nationalized banks. So, those banks whose shares, in whom the government of India had more than 50% of shares is a public sector bank. This question is asked. The shares of State Bank of India is held by whom? The government of India. Majority of shares of State Bank of India are held by whom? This question is asked. And the options given are Government of India, Reserve Bank of India, then so many other 2 or 3 more options are there. The obvious correct answer is Government of India. Incidentally, for your kind information, nearly 500 crores worth of shares was held by Reserve Bank of India in State Bank of India, which was then about 5 years back, which was transferred to Government of India. Why Reserve Bank of India chose to transfer that 500 crores worth of its shares to Government of India? The answer is that Reserve Bank of India is the regulator of all banks in our country. And as a regulator, it cannot have ownership in any of the regulated entities. It is something like if you are a referee, you cannot play the game. You cannot be a player. You can either be a player or you can be a referee. So, Reserve Bank being a referee, it cannot be part of the players. And therefore, they handed over 500 crores worth of its shares to Government of India. So, public sector banks are banks in whom the government of India has invested more than 50% of their shares. Then private sector banks. India had a long cherished history of private sector banks. Private sector banks were functioning for a long time. With the first bank, Bank of Hindustan, and then Allahabad Bank is the Allahabad Bank. All these banks, we had a long cherished history of private sector banks. Then the third category of banks under scheduled commercial bank is a foreign bank. What is a foreign bank? A foreign bank has its branches in India. It is incorporated outside India and it has its branches in India. Then in 1975-76, the government of India wanted focus more on rural areas, and they wanted a very adaptable bank to take care of the requirements of the rural area. Therefore, they came up with a new invention and an innovation called regional rural banks. And Reserve Bank has started two different type of licenses. One is the license is for small banks and the other is for payment banks. All these banks are coming under scheduled banks category. Small banks and payment banks, as and when they are incorporated and they start functioning, they will be added to the second schedule. Thus, to summarize, scheduled banks are those banks which are included in the second schedule of Reserve Bank of India. And scheduled banks, scheduled commercial bank. What is a commercial bank and cooperative bank? Commercial bank is a for-profit organization. Cooperative bank is for welfare organization. In India, we have both type of banks, commercial bank as well as cooperative bank. And the commercial banks, the scheduled commercial banks are divided into public sector banks, where more than 50% of the shares are held by Government of India. Private sector banks, where the shares are held by the public and not a single share is held by Government of India. Then third, foreign bank, which are incorporated outside in India, but they have their branches in operating in India. Then regional rural bank, which was started in 1975-76 to focus more on the rural credit and rural welfare. With so many developments taking place, with so many technological developments taking place, with mobile banking taking banking to a different dimension, we have to have different banks who are capable of adapting and absorbing the latest technology, especially the mobile technology that is available today, which has necessitated creation of small banks and payment banks.